All right, y'all. So we've just finished with the collapse of the Iron Curtain. We had Gorbachev's new thinking, perestroika, glasnost, these new ideas that it's going to eventually transform the USSR. But part of new thinking was also the repeal of the Brezhnev Doctrine. And with that, we saw the collapse of the Iron Curtain, but we don't see a hardliner reaction. Now, from 1989 to 1991, we're not going to see how that wave of nationalism that began in Eastern Europe sweeps into the Soviet Union. And I love this political cartoon because we see here, over here, we see Gorbachev leading the funeral of Soviet communism. And up here in the so-called communist paradise, we have Karl Marx, Lenin, and Stalin, who are now just shocked that their ideas failed. I like that political cartoon. It dates back to 1991. But let's go and get started. That wave of nationalism that started again in Eastern Europe sweeps into the USSR, especially with Glasnost, that easing of restrictions. These 92 nationalities and the 112 different language groups began to publish news in their own languages with their own perspectives. No longer were they oppressed with a singular communist Russian view. And with this, new ideas in Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan, and Ukraine, Belarus, the Baltic states, all of these groups began to think, how can they act independently of Russia? In the spring and summer of 1990, the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, declared their independence from the Soviet Union. And we watched. CNN had cameras 24 hours a day as we were waiting for the Red Army to oppress them. We already knew that the Red Army didn't oppress the fall of the Iron Curtain, but of course we thought they're going to maintain a sense of domination in their personal empire. And yet it doesn't happen. In June 1991, Boris Yeltsin, the Russian who mastered mass politics, became president of Russia in a landslide victory. And all of a sudden, we begin to see systematically the collapsing of the communist regime. That wave of nationalism is bringing the USSR down. And in the mix of all that, as you guys power out, we have the Baltic states, we have Ukraine, we have Belarus, Turkmenistan, Kazakhstan, a whole bunch of other stands. All of these areas are beginning to think, are we going to be independent? That's when the hardliner coup occurred. August 19th, 1991, the hardliners decided we are going to bring in the military to stop the collapse of our country. And the tanks came into the area. They kidnapped Gorbachev. They held him hostage in a hotel. And we're watching this unfold on CNN, wondering, are they going to kill Gorbachev? Which we kind of figured he was going to die. But instead, what happened? Boris Yeltsin, realizing that if the hardliner coup is successful, he in fact will probably be executed for treason. So Boris Yeltsin decided to lead a peaceful protest. He marched hundreds, if not thousands, of people of Moscow towards the tanks. Here's a photograph. They're actually sitting on a tank. And when he gets there, it's almost similar to when the International Women's Day, where the army, instead of firing on the women, they joined the women. Late into this coup, late August 19th, the army joined the people. And at that moment, the hardliners have lost. The hardliners are discredited, no longer have value. They're going to be arrested. But I want to point out, Gorbachev also looks weak. At this moment, the structure, the integrity of the USSR seemed to be crumbling. And I will tell you, Yeltsin becomes the hero of the day. By the end of August, the USSR was on its final demise. I love this political cartoon as you see sad Gorbachev, who knew this is a real possibility when he introduced new thinking. He hoped to spark an economic revolution. Instead, he sparked the political revolution that destroyed the once powerful and great Soviet Union. In December 1991, Ukraine, Russia, Belarus, and all of the other Soviet social republics declared their independence. So now the Soviet Union is no longer even a structure. And that's why on December 25th, 1991, Gorbachev announced his resignation. all of a sudden, the once great Soviet Union, who challenged the hegemony of the United States over Africa, Asia, South America, is now empty. It's nothing. But there is a fear, guys, because what's next? The Soviet Union had all those weapons. The Soviet Union it covered 12 to 13 time zones. It's a monstrosity. The fear is it's going to turn into a power vacuum. Instead, the Commonwealth of Independent States formed. It still exists today, but it's really meaningless. But in the 1990s, probably led by George Herbert Walker Bush, who was president in 1989 to 1993, I do think he probably had a significant influence here. He was the head of CIA before he became vice president in 1981. So he is in the know. So I do think we're eventually going to see classified documents that show how he helped mold this. But the group, the CIS, or Commonwealth of Independent States, it's a group of ex-Soviet social republics that voluntarily joined together. I want to point out the Baltic states, who are not Slavic, said, screw you, we'll never be part of it. But now, all of a sudden, they're working together. The hope was to prevent the region from becoming a power vacuum and still to protect the nuclear arms. Today, the CIS has become dominated by Putin and Russian interests. Georgia's no longer with it. The Ukraine's no longer with it, as Russia's invaded them twice. And we now see that there's more of a dominant people. There are political scientists who are fearing that Russia is going to reemerge and use the CIS to become a new version of the Soviet Union. We'll see what happens. I'm not totally down with that. I have a friend of mine who I have spoken to about that is really important with foreign policy, and he does not think that that's going to be a reality. But once again, who knows? So now the Cold War is over with, right? President Bush from 1989 to 1993 oversaw the final agreements. He made the final agreements with both Gorbachev and Yeltsin. He announced in 1991, he announced the Cold War was officially over with and that a new world order had emerged. Remember, that didn't go well for Wilson, and it didn't go well for FDR. And likewise, that's not going to go well for the United States, for George Herbert Walker Bush, and we'll see that. Bush promised Gorbachev and Yeltsin that NATO would not move 1 inch to the east. They wanted to maintain that NATO was not going to move. But what has happened, NATO? Look what all of this area, NATO. Who's being encroached upon? Yeah, I do hope you realize. From President Bill Clinton in the 1990s to George Herbert Walker Bush in the early 2000s, we systematically see the unfolding of Eastern Europe into NATO. It is becoming an American sphere of influence, and Russia is now responding. This is why Vladimir Putin today, let's jump right there now. The new Russia, Yeltsin's instability, the new Russia, right? Come back. Boris Yeltsin, he was a master politician early. He abandoned the Communist Party, began to preach Russian nationalism, and destroyed 20 other presidential candidates in the election of 1991. He won over 60% of the vote. He was so popular. But unfortunately, the economic transition because he wanted radical change. He didn't like perestroika, which was just restructuring. He wanted to go to a pure commercial free enterprise system. And that transition is not going to go well. And then as you power map, you saw that region called Chechnya. It's an Islamic region near Georgia upon the Caucasus Mountains. That's what it's called. And the Chechens, with that wave of nationalism, they decided that they were going to declare independence of Russia. Boris Yeltsin says enough, and he sent his Red Army. And I still remember that to this day when I was watching CNN and we watched the mighty Red Army restore its its lost dignity and invade Chechnya and destroy it. We began to, all of a sudden, the fear is Boris Yeltsin just another dictator? Unfortunately, it wasn't Boris Yeltsin. Boris Yeltsin got caught up with vodka, became an alcoholic, and he lost so much prestige that later, by 1999, he was no longer president, and Vladimir Putin. Vladimir Putin is the last head of the KGB. He is a Cold War warrior, and he now began to preach a new Russian nationalism based on Eastern Orthodoxy, which is really kind of crazy, guys. Think about it. As a communist, more likely he was an atheist, but now with this new Russian nationalism, he believes he is now the head, the political head of the Russian Orthodox Church, and he is preaching Christian values, which I will tell you, this is just real politics. The end justify the means. He has begun a new element of militarism. If you watch that video that I popped up on the updates, it's stinking crazy at what's happened. But that new Russian militarism has seen invasions of the Ukraine, challenging the stability of the world. He's more of a dictator than president. Yes, he wins all the elections, but there's really no competition. And one of his biggest competitors is actually in jail right now. I want to point out this is why Putin is so strong. Look what's happened economically. We see the Russian GDP is falling under the last years of Gorbachev, but look at the fall of the GDP under Boris Yeltsin. That economic transition from a command economy to a free enterprise system did not go well. And by 1999, when Vladimir Putin becomes the president, he begins to implement some totalitarian regimes, some nationalization, some command economy. The economy begins to get stronger. In 2007, 2008, when he loses power, there's an economic downturn. And then when he begins to wield more power, it begins to come in. Medvedev was the president in between these two terms because Vladimir Lenin could only be president for 8 years. Then they changed the constitution, and now he's president indefinitely. Medvedev was his cheap handpicked successor. But I do think that shows you kind of why people are supportive of him. So that's where we are, guys. I hope that makes sense to you. I hope we brought an end to that new Russia. We see how that happens. We've seen the collapse. You should be able to identify Reagan's role, Gorbachev's role, as well as Bush's role. You should see how Boris Yeltsin has now taken power, lost power, how Putin rose. There's the new nationalism and militarism. And I've mentioned the Ukraine about 5 times. That's an important region. With that said, I hope that makes sense.